It's good to see everyone again, Brian and John and other people in the thoughtful movement, if I can put it that way. Danny asked me to talk a little bit today about Alberta's budget, and it's always a risk after lunch talking about numbers and trying to make sense of that when you'd rather sleep after the lunch. And so let me try and jazz it up for you a little bit. But I'll talk about the challenges that we face in Alberta and the opportunities, because there are plenty of both. Let me start, though, with why numbers matter. Numbers reveal stuff. So if someone says, actually, let's go back to this screen. If someone says to you 7.3 or 4.2 or 8.9, it doesn't mean anything outside of context. But if you understand that something, I think this is an 8.0 earthquake on the Richter scale, that's the San Andreas Fault, then all of a sudden numbers connect to reality, right? The numbers represent something. The numbers tell you something about the risk. If you could predict earthquakes and someone said a 2.0 earthquake is coming your way versus an 8.0 earthquake, of course, that's a massive difference. So the numbers reveal something on the ground. They reveal something about what governments and frankly, all of us do in our lives every day as well. If I tell you that you're paying 200 to 300% extra, or at least a tax on your dairy products, well, that number is connected. That reveals something about the influence of the dairy lobby and the federal government, right? So numbers actually tell you something about power relationships, which is why I'm interested in it as a political scientist. So let's get into some of the numbers, though, here in Alberta. Let's start with some of the realities. In terms of recent Alberta budgets over the last 20 years, if you take a look at this, what you'll see is program spending over the last 20 years, adjusted for inflation. This comes from a recent study that I did. If you go back to 1993-94, that's about when Ralph Klein and his finance minister Jim Dinning and the caucus of the governing party at that time decided they wanted to get spending under control in Alberta because there were massive deficits. You had dead interest at that point. That was an increasingly large share of expenditures, equivalent in some cases to, in some years, to, I think it was about a third of the healthcare budget. So imagine that all that money is going to dead interest instead of paying nurses to help you out in the hospital, that sort of thing. So there were all sorts of reasons why the province had to get its spending under control. And if we those are the global numbers in billions, adjusted for inflation. Now let's take a look at it, though, because you expect budgets to go up over time. Although again, these numbers are adjusted for inflation, but let's adjust them for per person. So this is program spending, and I emphasize program spending because one hears in Alberta, as you would elsewhere, well, the province is growing, you need to spend extra money. Yes, you do. So you adjust a budget for per capita, in other words, per person, how much they're spending. And I'm looking just at programs right here. Why is that? Because if you can save money on programs, or if you don't spend so much on programs, what does that open up possibilities for? Well, it's kind of like a personal budget. If you don't spend money going out 3 times a week, you might have opportunity to take that money and save it up for your car or something, right? Same with the provincial budget. If you're not spending money on as much money on programs as maybe some people would like, you can hive off some of that money for something else in the case of Alberta capital spending or for the Heritage Fund or whatever. But this is per capita program spending. So you'll see back in the early 1990s, it was about $9,000 per person. Then it dropped to about $6,800 after some of the budget cuts in the mid-1990s. By 2004-05, a decade ago, it was back to $9,000 per person. So again, adjusted for inflation, and per capita, of course, means per person. So they're increasing spending in real terms. Now look at what happened after mid-decade, the last decade. Spending continued to increase in Alberta, up to almost $11,000 last year per person. Okay, well, what does that mean? It means this, that the province ended up spending a lot more every year than they had to just to keep up with population growth and inflation. If you look back to a decade ago and look at the big numbers on program spending on the left-hand side there, you'll see that it was $29 billion. And this is from a recent study I did for the Fraser Institute. And you can extrapolate ahead. The red line is what they actually spent, what the province actually spent on programs. And the blue line or purple line, depending on your eyesight, and depending on how the computer reveals it, that's what the province could have spent, could have increased spending, but what they could have spent if they'd kept program spending increases to population growth and inflation, right? And you have to pay attention to that. Again, if new people are coming and you've got inflation, you've got to up the budget, okay? We get that, unless you want to find savings somewhere else. Nonetheless, the difference between what the province could have spent had they been more prudent, spent according to population growth and inflation, versus what they did spend. If you look at the two numbers on the right-hand side, almost $44 billion versus almost $36 billion. That's an $8 billion difference. Does that ring any bells? The current projected deficit, next year anyway, the budget you're about to start, the Premier, Jim Prentice, has talked about a $7 billion gap. Right, okay? And there's no question that when oil revenues plummet, oil prices plummet, and revenues plummet because of that, or natural gas prices, which are down, have been down for some time, it matters to your budget. But of course, the spending side matters as well. It's not one or the other. But my point about this study that we released, and we got a fair amount of attention to it, is that if they'd been more prudent over the last 10 years and spent according to population growth and inflation on the program side, their spending right now would be about $8 billion less per person. We would be talking about surpluses still, not deficits, right? Now, that matters because, again, in total, if you kind of looked at the middle part between those two lines, in total over the past decade then, the province has spent $49 billion more on programs than they had to keep up with population growth and inflation. Now, what could you have bought with $49 billion? At least a couple of new hospitals, at least. Money into the Heritage Fund. Other capital improvements in schools. Could have repaired some roads. Could have probably tripled the size of the highway between here and Edmonton that some of you drove down on, like Danny. I mean, there's all sorts of options, obviously. So again, that's why I looked at program spending. I wanted to say, if you've been prudent on the program spending front, on your day-to-day budget in a household, if you hadn't gone out for dinner 3 times a week and spent $200 each time you went out for dinner, you would have had money for that new car down the road. Instead, the province blew it all on program spending, so to speak. Now, again, program spending is necessary for a whole bunch of reasons, but the province is pretty imprudent. What I've often compared this to recently is someone who earns, say, $60,000 a year and one year gets a Christmas bonus of $15,000. Now, if that person goes out and says, yeehaw, I'm going to have a salary or I'm going to have income of $75,000 every year and incurs obligations, needing $75,000 every year, if they assume that $15,000 bonus every year, they're going to end themselves up in a heap of trouble when one Christmas that bonus doesn't arrive. That is Alberta time and again, where the province spends up to the limit, assumes resource revenues and $130 or $40 or $50 oil is going to be there forever. Natural gas will stay at 13. It was that high one year. When you expect that Christmas bonus every year and you budget for that, you end up with problems. And that's exactly what happened over the past decade here in Alberta. So that's kind of the fiscal side of things when you look at the spending. And the spending side is one that is often ignored. I mean, what do you often hear when we get into these crises? If only Alberta would be responsible. And often people mean tax more. Okay, well, if this was 100 years ago, I might agree with them. Raise a few taxes here or there. Impose a sales tax like they did in 1936 in Alberta. It was here for 1 year, by the way. And they kicked it out. Okay, if it was 100 years ago, maybe. But today, there are plenty of taxes. And as this chart shows, the problem really is spending. I would argue, at least in the medium to long term. In the short term, you're not going to get around what's happened now. They will probably come in, obviously, with a deficit budget, borrow some money, borrow more money, spend whatever they have left of the sustainability fund. I suspect they will raise taxes, and that's the predicament we're in. Now, let me stop and take a drink of water, and then let's move on to some opportunities, though, because as good fiscal conservatives, which I assume you are, and believers in economic growth, and economic growth matters, let's think about the possibilities for Alberta, though. Sorry, actually, before I do that, let me explain some of the details of where the money went in the past decade. Also from past work that I and others have done at the Fraser Institute. Okay, so where did that $49 billion go, the extra money? Again, beyond population growth and inflation on the program side. Well, we know that government wages and public sector wages are about 7% above the private sector. This is a calculation my colleagues made recently. We published this before. This takes out length of time in the workforce. This takes out education, or it accounts for it, rather, It accounts for all those factors, and my colleagues found that the public sector, the broad public sector in Alberta, is still paid about 7%, rounding off there, higher than the private sector. That may not sound like a lot, but multiply 7% or take 7% and think about a couple of 100,000 public sector workers in the province. That makes a difference to your budget. We also know that pension contribution rates, something I've looked at over the years. Pension contribution rates, what I mean by that is if a civil servant is paying 5 or 10% and the province is chipping in the same amount, well, pension contribution rates have doubled, as much as doubled in some cases, over doubled in some cases, 116% over the past 15 years or so. That matters, right? I know in the last 2 years alone, for example, pension payments just on the government side have gone up from about $4.1 billion to about $4.9 billion, $800 million in just 2 years. And the province doesn't have numbers available for that. I'm sure it's much less. I'm sure we're talking billions of dollars in differences over the last 5 or 10 years if you go back earlier than just the last 2. So there's wages, there's pension costs. And again, let me stop here and emphasize. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with having pensions for government workers. My preferred model, and I won't get into the weeds here, my preferred model is defined contribution plans as they have in Saskatchewan, as was introduced in Saskatchewan under Alan Blakeney and the NDP in the 1970s. Without getting too deep into the weeds, those are affordable in the sense that governments can control what they want to contribute to the employee's pension fund. And of course, a defined contribution plan, kind of like your RSP, relies on what? Market returns, right? That's your pension. And that's not a bad pension, by the way, for most people, because that's what most of us live with. But defined benefit plans are really popular in the public sector, and I think they need to be reformed. But when defined benefit plans, which are basically promises, when the rate of return doesn't accrue in those pension plans to what people hope, you of course end up with liabilities or projected liabilities. What happens? Contribution rates goes up. Who pays? Taxpayers. And that means money has to be diverted from elsewhere. So those are some of the reasons Alberta's in a mess. How about some other reasons? The province is very generous under the late Premier, if I can put it that way. The former Premier, Ed Stelmach, he once signed a teacher's wage deal that was double the rate of inflation for a 5-year period. That matters. I think the top rate of pay for a teacher in Alberta is about $99,000. That I'm going from memory here, but I believe that was about $18,000 more than the top rate in British Columbia, and something like $8,000 or $9,000 over the top rate in Ontario. Simple question. Where are taxes lower? Alberta. Where are housing costs higher? Toronto and Vancouver. I think it's a bit much to justify some public sector wages that are higher than other provinces based on those two facts alone. So, but that's another reason why the budget got out of control. Wage deals that were generous to some in the public sector. And again, you need teachers, you need nurses, you need some in the public sector, even though some of the stuff is also done in the private sector. That's a different debate. Nonetheless, so long as you have people employed by government and paid by taxes, there's a duty, I think, on politicians to be prudent, and they haven't been. Other reasons, well, let me give you an example. 2009, the province spent $1.2 billion on the teachers' pension plan, a bailout, partial bailout. Again, ask yourself, and I try and point this out to people, to say, oh, you're just against government. No, government's reality, taxes and civilization, I get all that. But there are choices to be made by politicians, and if you spend over $1 billion on a partial bailout of one public sector pension plan, what happens? That's $1.2 billion you don't have to build schools. I mean, to me, it's a simple mathematical equation, which I'm always amazed people don't get or don't care to acknowledge. And they always just veer over to the spending side or the tax side. How can we tax people more? Again, those are some of the reasons why Alberta's in a bit of a pickle, because of past choices. All right, some facts. Half the budget, at least for program spending, is made up of wages and benefits in Alberta. Some facts. In the private sector, you're likely to retire much earlier. You will retire much earlier, at least a year earlier on average, than private sector workers. And again, as I alluded to earlier, you'll find in the public sector, most of the public sector is covered by a registered pension plan, and it's a defined benefit plan. Unlike the private sector, where about a fifth of the population is covered by a registered pension plan, and about half of those, by the way, are defined benefit plans. So there is an imbalance between the private sector and the public sector that I think needs to be corrected if you're going to long-term correct some of the budget problems in Alberta and elsewhere across the country. Okay, those are a lot of numbers, but you can ask me about them in Q&A. So the challenges, this is an old cartoon. I think I've still got this in the new edition of Tax Mem Canadian. In the back there is Paul Martin. This was published when he was finance minister back in the 1990s. And back when they were having these debates in the mid-1990s when Paul Martin and company had to cut some federal spending. Paul Martin is the line deciding who's he going to go after. And the sheep is taxpayers. And the big thing there is, of course, an elephant with federal public service unions on it. It is very difficult for politicians to garner the courage to say to a couple 100,000 people in a province or a couple of million across the country, we're going to change your compensation, or we're going to freeze it, or we're going to change your pension plan. That's a pretty difficult political calculation. Nonetheless, I think it needs to be done. But that's the reality. That's the challenge for politicians, even who want reform. Again, ironically, and maybe this is a Nixon to China, the New Democrats in Saskatchewan changed public sector pensions in 1977 to define benefit plans for any new employees. It was a long-term thing. It's a policy wonk thing, but it works to keep your pension costs controllable. Those are rare instances. We'll see what the province of Alberta does in about 2 weeks in their budget. All right. Now, opportunities, though. Let's be a bit positive for a few minutes here. One way to get your budget under control is, of course, to control the spending side, and I think that's necessary through some of the examples I just gave you. But another thing we need to think about, of course, is expanding the economy. And Alberta's been pretty good at this, right? One can be critical of some of the budget decisions in the past decade in AM, but compared to the rest of the country, as you're about to see, Alberta's still doing pretty well. It's done pretty well. I have faith, actually, that unless the province messes things up in the next budget or next couple of budgets, hopefully Alberta will bounce back sooner than people think. Right? You're hearing all sorts of negativity, sometimes gloating, which I think is unfortunate in parts of the country that go, well, Alberta's too reliant on this or that, oil and gas. They should be smarter. They expect a lower dollar to rescue Ontario's manufacturing economy and perhaps Quebec's economy. I'm not so sure that's going to happen, as much as I want Ontario and Quebec and Atlantic Canada to succeed. And I'll show you why here. I'm going to show you some slides now from a couple of recent studies. I've combined them to try and give you a sense of how well Alberta has done and why I think it'll do well into the future, and a few key things to think about. But one of the studies was about young adult migration to the province over the last 10 years, because I wanted to show people where the opportunities were. And for those of you familiar with kind of what's been happening in Canada, this won't be a surprise. And then I'll also end off with some other slides that show where the population patterns have been for everybody, the working age population. But let's get into why people move where they do, or why opportunities are created. If you want opportunities, what do you got to do? You got to follow the private sector investment money. Here is, in billions, the trend, and these are adjusted for inflation. Here's the 2-decade trend. And this was from a study I released, the Fraser Institute released, that I authored in November. And you'll see here, the top line is Alberta. In 1 year alone, those numbers on the right-hand side are 2012 numbers, $60 billion. Compare that to Quebec down there, $25 billion, or Ontario. So put this together. In 2012, Alberta had almost as much investment as Ontario and Quebec combined, despite a much smaller population. That tells you why Alberta was booming for so long. And it's been, if you look at the red line, it crossed Ontario about a decade ago, over a decade ago, in terms of private sector investment. This excludes housing, by the way, so you're not getting, for example, in British Columbia, the numbers skewed by lots of retirees moving there and that affecting private sector investment. This is about manufacturing. This is about oil sands. It's about setting up a corn processing facility in Saskatchewan, that sort of thing. So private sector investment, business investment. Look at Atlantic Canada. Newfoundland's come up, that's the yellow line. Again, oil and gas. And these numbers, of course, in 2014 or 2015 will take a hit. Now let's look at per capita, because the numbers are even more staggering. Alberta on top, $45,000 per worker in the last year in this particular scale. Saskatchewan right up there as well. It's done very well. At the bottom, Quebec, $10,000 per worker. Ontario, about the same. I want you to look at Quebec and Ontario at the bottom there, those numbers. Now look at the next slide. Except for Newfoundland, out in Atlantic Canada, private sector investment in Ontario and Quebec has been no better over recent years. Look at the bottom of this one compared to Atlantic Canada. Private sector investment per worker in Ontario and Quebec hasn't been any better than what's been happening in Manitoba, barely better than Nova Scotia. The opportunities have not been created in Ontario and Quebec for a very long time. That's why they've had such a tough time of it. Now, when you get private sector investment, it equals job opportunities. Let's take a look at a few slides for young adults. Maybe some of your kids were out in Central or Eastern Canada and came back west. Or maybe you live out in Central Eastern Canada and some of your kids migrated out west. Here's why. Full-time employment. What I did is I wanted to look at working age young adults, right? So 25 to 34-year-olds. By then, they're probably finished university. They are looking for jobs, of course. They're in their career, early part of their career. The employment rate is the highest in Alberta, followed by Saskatchewan. Quebec's doing not too bad on this one. But where's the growth rate over the last 10 years for young adults starting out in their career? Well, the growth has been in Western Canada. If you look at the right there, Saskatchewan, Alberta, followed by BC. Quebec, though, has done better than Ontario. Ontario has been really bad for the past 10 years. This explains why young adults are coming out west. And of course, as unfortunately has been the case for decades, Atlantic Canada. The numbers there have been negative for some time, and this shows that. Let's take a look at unemployment for 25 to 34-year-olds. But I want to show you by education level. One of the things people often don't understand, and I try and explain this to people, is that when economies tank, who does the worst immediately? It's those on the margins. And by the margins, I mean those who don't have much education, those who don't have much skill, right? The PhDs, or most of the PhDs, or the company presidents in downtown Calgary, they will do fine when oil is $50 or $150. It really doesn't matter to them. Who does it matter to? When some of the people in the office towers, when they cut some jobs in the office towers here and close down an office, who loses her job right away? Someone who just came here from the Philippines is trying to send some money back home to her husband and kids. Okay, that's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy for people with low education, regardless of where they're from. We have to remember that. The point of prosperity is, in my view anyway, because you want people to flourish. You want human flourishing. And we all need a job. At least most of us do, unless we come from the royal family or, have money, family money from a century ago or something, which doesn't describe me and I don't think describes most people in this room. Let's look at the unemployment rate by education level. For those with less than a high school education, where's the lowest unemployment rate? It's the red bar, Alberta. Again, this is an average, by the way, over the 10-year period that I'm looking at here. This to me is tremendously encouraging. Bless you. This to me is tremendously encouraging. Alberta said, yeah, come here, invest your money. And jobs were created. And Alberta is the only place where someone with less than a high school education, that their unemployment rates were in the single digits. Look at the tragedy of Newfoundland. Even though Newfoundland has come up in the past little while, you had a 1 in 3 chance of being unemployed in Newfoundland in the past 10 years. Compared to Alberta, you had a 1 in 10 chance if you didn't have high school education. And next on the list, you see Manitoba after Alberta, and then Saskatchewan. Now, as I'll get into in a moment, of course, migration numbers matter here, right? Manitoba sometimes does well on indicators, but you have to understand that's because they've been losing young people for a very long time. And the same was true of Saskatchewan until recent years. And it's the same with, Atlantic Canada has been losing people, and it still has bad numbers. But that's some high school. Let's look at high school graduates. Again, lowest unemployment rates for high school graduates in the West. And this, as you'll see again, despite high in-migration to into Alberta and to British Columbia. Post-secondary. SAIT is just down the road from here, technical school. If you've got a post-secondary certificate, you're going to do well. Your unemployment rate is lowest in Alberta and pretty low across the rest of the country. But still, look at Ontario. It's pretty much double the rate of Alberta. Same thing with Quebec. So engineers were coming here, right? At least until we hit $50 oil. University degree. Again, lowest rates in the West pretty much. Lowest rate, and New Brunswick hasn't done too bad here as well. But again, keep in mind Atlantic Canada has been losing people, which explains some of their relatively lower numbers here. Okay, so That's been the unemployment numbers for young adults. What about per capita income? Now for everybody. Per capita income has been huge. In Alberta, it's been growing. You see a different figure there. This part of the study, again, this was to explain why the West has been a land of opportunity. This part of the study that we released, I wanted to say to people, okay, if you care about the poor, if you care about creating opportunity, if you care, by the way, about the middle class, we hear a lot about these days, where is the middle class? It's in Alberta, right, in terms of per capita income. And here's another way to look at the middle class, or the increase anyway, in per capita income. Again, Alberta followed by followed by Newfoundland and followed by Saskatchewan. Side point, allowing people to develop your resources or your economy in general, whether you have resources or not, matters. Okay, here's something else on the middle class. What happens when you have investment plus jobs plus employment plus lots of income? Well, if you're a government who likes tax, or anybody, think you have to have some taxes to pay for services, and again, with a view to the middle income earner, where are the middle incomes in this country? Where are people prospering? Well, what province do you think has the smallest proportion of tax filers under 30,000? And I'm using this as a proxy. Economists have debates about how to define the middle class or low income. Under 30,000, let's pretend as a proxy that's low income, which for a lot of people it is. But as a proxy for, say, poor Canadians. The provinces with the smallest tax filers under 30,000, Alberta and Saskatchewan. Highest over in Atlantic Canada. Look at the red bar, 42% in Alberta, 47% in Saskatchewan. The black bar, look at Ontario, 50% of tax filers there file under $30,000. Now, not everybody who files under $30,000 is necessarily poor. Maybe they're married to a millionaire. Maybe they have $1 million in the bank and they can live on $30,000 from their investments, whatever it is. Nonetheless, it's a bit of a proxy for where the money is, if I can put it that way. Where's the middle income? Where's the middle class? Again, Alberta and Saskatchewan. All right, look at the red bar, look at the black bar. Smallest middle class, at least using 30 to 99,000 as a proxy in Newfoundland. Province with the largest proportion of six-figure tax filers. Let's suppose you're a provincial government. You'd like revenues from high-income earners. Well, you need lots of high-income earners, and they're showing up in Alberta, and to a lesser degree, Saskatchewan and Ontario. So these slides show you where the middle class is and where high-income earners are reporting their income. Basically in the West, vis-a-vis the rest of the country on these indicators. So Alberta and Saskatchewan to a lesser degree, and to a lesser degree British Columbia, has been creating the opportunities for some time. And even governments who like tax revenue have been benefiting from that. Okay, now, is it all about luck? Because that's what you hear. Is it just because Alberta has these things, cranes to the old fashioned derricks rather, that you see on the prairies for conventional oil extraction? Is it just because Alberta has oil and natural gas? And Saskatchewan has potash? Is it because British Columbia historically had mines, or at least they used to have mines? They have some still. It's just very difficult to get anything done in British Columbia these days, unfortunately. But is it all about luck? That's what you often hear, especially when Alberta was booming. It's just about luck. Any idiot could run the province and have a surplus. Apparently not. No, it's not all about luck. In fact, I was just reading this morning about the tragedy of Venezuela. Anybody here been to Venezuela? Okay. What did you think of Venezuela when you were there? When were you there, sir?
Well, I was never there.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Okay. Somebody's been to Venezuela?
Yeah.
John has? And who else? Okay. John, what did you see when you were in Venezuela, when you were there?
Income inequality. A lot of slums and a lot of rich people. That was in 94.
Okay. And it's probably worse. John, for those watching the video, John Robinson said he was in Venezuela in 1994 and saw income inequality and slums. Some rich people and a lot of slums. And John's right. Just because you have oil or natural gas or some other natural resource doesn't mean you're going to have a relatively rich society where most people, where there's a large middle class, hopefully very few poor people, if any, and some rich folk. It's not just about luck, of course. It's about whether you have the right policies that allow people to make a buck and allow everyone to prosper. So compare, on the left-hand side, Hong Kong, which has no natural resources that I'm aware of. That's the picture on the left, picture of Hong Kong. And on the right, that's Nigeria. And Nigeria, along with Venezuela, is an example of two jurisdictions that have natural resources but don't have a large middle class. Your policies matter. Nigeria, here's another picture. You can see kind of a bit of a slum there and lots of kind of a shanty town. We have this index, I won't get into details, but something called economic freedom, good property rights, rule of law, sensible regulation, that sort of thing. Well, Nigeria is 124th on this list. Hong Kong is number 1. You don't need neat resources to become wealthy, to have most people prosper. Hong Kong has its problems. It's not perfect, but it's much more perfect than Nigeria, which has resources, or Venezuela, or Quebec. Hong Kong's done well relative to the rest of Asia, of course, because of what the British brought there in terms of the rule of law, property rights, and the rest of it. In fact, for the longest time, has done better than Britain. Irony of ironies, until Margaret Thatcher came along and managed to help correct some of the problems in Great Britain. All right, okay. I'll end with this, though. Yes, what about $50 oil, though? That's all very nice. So back to where we are. Well, and this is something I added recently for another presentation to some students here in Calgary that I spoke to a couple of weeks ago. What about $50 oil? Surely that must make a difference. And again, even if it's not luck, even if Alberta's had basically some decent policies over the past 2-3 decades to allow everybody to profit from natural resources, which is our advantage in this province, right? We're not Hawaii. We don't have warm weather to sell to tourists. You have to work with what you've got, whether it's warm weather, whether it's access to the U.S. market in Ontario and Quebec, right? Big population base south of the border there, or whether it's oil and gas and potash in the west. You have to work with what you have. So now we're in a situation where we've got $45, $50 oil. Isn't that going to mean the end of Western prosperity? Well, the only way to really get at this or to think about this is to say you can't foretell the future, but this isn't the first time Alberta's had some problems here. The West in general has had some low resource prices. How have we done over the last couple of decades when this has happened before? I'll show you how we've done. The unemployment rate for 15 years and above. This is the annual average going all the way back to 1982. I first moved to Alberta in 1988. Terrible time then. They were just recovering from the 1986 low hit to oil prices, where the prices basically halved in a couple of months, like they did recently. And you could get an apartment with 1 month free, for a year's lease. It was quite an interesting time. You didn't quite have like sagebrush, or those one of those western tumbleweeds, rolling down the highway, but it was close to that in 1988 when I first moved here. It wasn't a great situation, unfortunately. Came here to get an education, and that was one of the educations I got. Nonetheless, looking back to 1982, the average unemployment rate was the second lowest in the country. This is an annual average over the last 40 years. And I say this to be encouraging. Saskatchewan's was lower, but as I'll show you in a moment, again, that's because people were leaving Saskatchewan. And who is next? Ontario had the next lowest unemployment rate. Sorry, Manitoba, and then Ontario, and then BC. But that's the average unemployment rate over the last 40 years. Now, Alberta suffered some terrible outmigration in the 1980s, about 80,000 people net to other provinces. But even including that number, that awful decade, the 1980s, what you'll see from this slide, the red bar, is Alberta. And British Columbia next to it. And I emphasize, this is the working age population. It's not retirees. So we're not including, again, people flocking to my hometown of Kelowna to retire and enjoy the sunshine and great wine. Plug for my hometown. You can go there and buy local wine. So this is the working age population, or at least most of them. So this is net migration. Quebec lost 237,000 people. Ontario, all it gained, interprovincial migration numbers, 50,000 in the entire last 4 decades. It doesn't mean Ontario hasn't grown. Most provinces have grown in population. But we're talking about people may come to the country, people will be born in a certain province, the net interprovincial migration. Again, people are heading somewhere else for jobs, is what this particular slide shows. And mainly to Alberta and BC over the last 4 decades, despite, again, some tough times in the 1980s. These are the net numbers. All right. So again, look at the unemployment rate and understand that despite the problems we've had, we've seen $50 oil before. In fact, I think we saw $12 oil back in 2001, if I recall, or $18. It was pretty low just after 9/11 for a bit. And the same thing in the early 1990s and after 86. So one doesn't know the future, but keep this in mind, especially when you look at the budget 2 weeks from now. Why has Alberta, and I think the West in general, prospered? I think it's because mainly we've had the right policies. Not perfect, not without challenges. British Columbia has a challenge with trying to do deals with First Nations people on treaties. The courts have been, I think, entirely unhelpful on that in the way they've interpreted some things. Alberta has some challenges right now, obviously with $50 oil. Saskatchewan had some challenges for years with policy, but the Saskatchewan New Democrats actually started to improve policy a bit in the 1990s and before they left office in the last decade. And Brad Wall has continued the policy improvements there. If you remember British Columbia, and I grew up there, I remember Bill Bennett, a premier there, who corrected some bad policy starting in the late 1970s. Privatization started in British Columbia, in part because of the influence of the Fraser Institute and Mike Walker, who recommended such policies. And they got their budgets under control in British Columbia a decade before anyone ever heard of Ralph Klein and what he did to budgets here in Alberta 2 decades ago. So the West for some time has been, I think, mostly getting the policy mix right, not without some problems, but has mostly gotten it right. So when you look at the next budget coming out, the key question is, are they going to mess this up? Are they going to do things that will stem the possibility for private sector investment to flow into this province? Ask the same question about British Columbia. Ask the same question about Saskatchewan. Are they going to do anything that's going to harm private sector investment possibilities? If they do, you're going to see some of these numbers turn negative. If they don't, I think you will see that Alberta and the other Western provinces, because they're flexible, because they attract investment, because they're trying to be friendly to business in a good way, by allowing for people to make a buck. If they continue to do that, I think the West will bounce back sooner rather than later. I just think it's inevitable. And all of these questions, of course, can be asked about provinces around the rest of the country. Why doesn't Quebec? Why do Quebec and Ontario not have the same sort of private sector investment numbers we do? Well, the oil sands are a capital-intensive industry. That's true. Ontario and Quebec have maybe established infrastructure in the private sector in some cases. Maybe they don't need as much private sector investment in some cases. Nonetheless, they're still not getting, even if you try and account for those factors, the kind of investment the West has been getting. And a lot of it has to do with policy in Ontario and Quebec in particular, or politics in the case of Quebec in particular, the separatist politics going back decades. So any province can be asked this question: are you being sensible on policy? And that implies a whole number of things I won't get into today. But that's what you need for private sector investment. So let's recap. To review, low levels of this, and I've removed all the other provinces and just given you Quebec and Ontario. Look at the very bottom. And remember how Alberta and Saskatchewan had lines way up there. If you have low levels of this, private sector investment per worker, you end up with what? This. Somebody needing a job, right? I think the West has been good on policy, and as long as nobody messes that up in the near term, I think we'll bounce back sooner rather than later. So challenges aside, there are opportunities for the West as well, and I think they'll return soon. Thank you very much.